The distant ridges cast long shadows over the valley as twilight falls. If you're watching this from anywhere east of the Mississippi, you might feel a strange familiarity with what I'm about to tell you. Before we dive into this disturbing piece of forgotten American history, tell me in the comments, have you ever heard of the Melungeons? This forgotten people whose very existence has been largely erased from our collective memory? What I'm about to share isn't just a story, it's a warning about how easily entire communities can vanish when society decides they're better off forgotten. In the spring of 1895, in the remote hills of eastern Tennessee, nestled between Blackwater Creek and the Clinch River, sat a small settlement known locally as Vardy. This wasn't just any mountain community. The people who lived there, around 40 families in total, were known as Melungeons, a mysterious mixed-race group with disputed origins. Some claimed they descended from Portuguese sailors. Others said they had Turkish blood, while local whites often branded them with more derogatory labels. What made the Vardy community unusual, even among Melungeon settlements, was their relative prosperity. They owned land when many couldn't, maintained a small school, and kept largely to themselves. The first time I heard about the Vardy incident was from my grandmother, who grew up in neighboring Hancock County. She would lower her voice to a whisper when speaking of it, as if the very mention might summon something unwelcome. There are places in these mountains, she'd say, where the soil remembers what was done, even when people try to forget. As a child, I dismissed these as the superstitious ramblings of an old woman. As an adult researching disappearances across Appalachia, I discovered a pattern that led me back to her warnings. County records show that on April 17, 1895, a census taker named Jeremiah Collins was dispatched to document the residents of Vardy. His official report, filed 3 days later, contained a single chilling note. Settlement appears abandoned, no residents found. What happened to approximately 160 men, women, and children who, according to church records from just 2 weeks prior, had attended Easter services in their small wooden chapel? No bodies were recovered, no mass graves were discovered, no witnesses came forward with accounts of violence or forced removal. They simply vanished, families, possessions, livestock, leaving behind only empty cabins with doors still latched from the inside. I spent 3 years tracing the paper trail of this disappearance through fragmented archives, private collections, and oral histories passed down through generations of mountain families. What emerged wasn't just the story of a vanished community, but a deliberate effort to erase their very existence from official records. The deeper I dug, the more resistance I encountered, closed archives, missing documents, and local residents who still, over a century later, refuse to speak of certain hollows after dark. What's most disturbing isn't just that an entire community disappeared overnight. It's how quickly their absence was rationalized away. Those Melungeons probably just moved on, the county sheriff is quoted as saying in the Bristol Herald. Their kind never stays in one place too long. No formal investigation was launched. No search parties were organized. The surrounding communities, who had always viewed the Melungeons with suspicion, seemed almost relieved they were gone. Within months, timber companies began surveying the abandoned lands, and by year's end, the settlement was being dismantled for lumber. But one detail never made the newspapers, a detail I discovered in Collins' personal journal, now housed in the Tennessee State Archives. On his return journey from Vardy, Collins wrote, "Found peculiar marks carved into trees surrounding the settlement, not like any trailblazes I've seen. Inside the cabins, root cellars appear recently excavated, floors torn up. Something happened here that defies explanation, though I fear my superiors have little interest in the fate of such people." The journal continues with observations that Collins omitted from his official report, descriptions of half-eaten meals, beds still made with personal items laid out as if for the next day, and, most disturbingly, a series of small footprints in the dust of several cabins that seemed to lead nowhere. Collins noted that many of these prints appeared to have 6 toes, a genetic trait documented among some Melungeon families. Most chilling was his account of the settlement's chapel, where he found the community Bible still open on the pulpit, a passage from Exodus underlined in fresh ink. And they departed from Ramesses in the first month on the 15th day of the first month, and the children of Israel went out with an high hand in the sight of all the Egyptians. Next to this, scrawled in the margin in a shaky hand, "They come at night. We must go beneath." I visited the site of Vardy myself in the fall of 2018. The settlement is long gone, the land now part of a state wildlife management area. Standing in the clearing where the chapel once stood, I experienced a profound sense of absence, not just of structures, but of memory itself. It was as if the very air resisted remembering what had once existed there. Local forestry officials warned me not to venture too deep into the surrounding hollows, citing unstable ground and old mine shafts. When pressed, one admitted, "Some places just don't want to be disturbed. People go missing in these parts even today." To understand what happened at Vardy, we must first understand who the Melungeons were and why their existence provoked such discomfort in post-Civil War Appalachia. The term Melungeon itself is thought to derive from the French mélange, or mixing, reflecting their mixed racial heritage. In an America increasingly defined by rigid racial categorization, the Melungeons existed in a liminal space, neither white nor black nor Native American, yet with features and customs that suggested connections to all three, and possibly more. The landscape around Vardy was punishing: steep hollows cut by fast-moving creeks, thick forests of oak and hickory, and narrow paths that became impassable during heavy rains. The Melungeons had settled there not by choice, but by necessity, pushed to the margins by a society that had no place for them. They lived in small cabins built of rough-hewn logs, most with just 2 rooms separated by stone fireplaces. Their gardens clung to hillsides too steep for plows, and their livestock, mostly goats and chickens, foraged in the surrounding woods. What few photographs survive of Vardy show a settlement that blended seamlessly into the landscape, as if growing organically from the mountainside. Cabins were positioned to maximize sunlight during short winter days, gardens terraced with remarkable engineering skill, and paths laid with flat river stones to prevent erosion during spring floods. These details speak to a community with deep knowledge of their environment and the intention to remain permanently, not a people preparing to abandon their homes. Life in the settlement followed the rhythm of seasons. Men hunted and maintained small copper mines that had been worked for generations. Women preserved food for winter, maintained medicinal herb gardens, and passed down oral histories that stretched back to lands across the ocean. Children attended school when they could, though education beyond basic reading was rare. They spoke a dialect peppered with words from Portuguese, Turkish, and indigenous languages, another aspect of their identity that isolated them from surrounding communities. I discovered a partial student roster from the Vardy School dated January 1895, just months before the disappearance. 27 children between the ages of 6 and 16 were listed, along with assessments of their progress in reading, writing, and arithmetic. The teacher, identified only as Miss Naomi, noted that several of the younger children demonstrated unusual aptitude for mathematics and mechanical drawing, and that the older boys had constructed a working water wheel to power a small grain mill. These mundane details, a community improving its infrastructure, children learning, seasons changing, make what followed all the more disturbing. There was no indication of decline, no suggestion of a people preparing to abandon generations of work. If anything, the documentary evidence points to a community actively building for its future. The Mason family, headed by patriarch Elijah Mason, was considered the founders of Vardy. Elijah's cabin stood at the center of the settlement, larger than most, with glass windows, a luxury in these parts. His wife Sarah kept detailed records of births, deaths, and marriages in a leather-bound journal that later disappeared along with everything else. Their daughter, Naomi, taught at the settlement's one-room schoolhouse and was, according to church records, engaged to be married the very week the community vanished. Through extensive research in regional archives, I uncovered a daguerreotype of Elijah Mason from 1882, taken during a rare trip to Knoxville. He stands straight-backed despite his 60-plus years, with striking features, copper skin, steel-gray eyes, and a full beard streaked with white. The photographer's notes describe him as dignified in bearing, articulate in speech, though reluctant to discuss his ancestry when questioned directly. What set the Masons apart wasn't just their standing within the community, but their determination to preserve Melungeon identity while seeking recognition from the outside world. Elijah had repeatedly petitioned county officials to recognize their land claims and rightful citizenship, actions that earned both respect from his people and resentment from powerful interests eyeing the valuable timber and mineral rights on Melungeon land. In 1893, Elijah had successfully defended the community's land rights in county court, producing deeds dating back to the early 1800s, an unusual legal victory for non-whites in that era. The local newspaper reported that the judge appeared visibly disturbed by the outcome, but found the documentation irrefutable. This legal victory came just 18 months before the community's disappearance. I found correspondence between county officials and representatives of Eastern timber companies dating from this period, expressing alarm at the precedent set by Mason's court victory. One letter stated bluntly, "If these people are permitted to establish legal ownership, others of their kind will follow suit. The economic implications for future development in the region would be severe." Another responded, "There are ways to address such problems without resorting to courts. The matter will resolve itself in time." The winter of 1894-95 had been particularly harsh. Food stores ran low by February, and illness, likely influenza, swept through the settlement, claiming the lives of several elders and at least 2 children. But by all accounts, the community was recovering. The spring planting had begun. Repairs to storm-damaged cabins were underway. Nothing in the written record suggests a community preparing to abandon their homes. Weather records from nearby monitoring stations indicate an unusual pattern that winter: prolonged cold, followed by rapid warming that caused dangerous flooding along the Clinch River. Local newspapers reported multiple drownings and property damage throughout the region. The Vardy settlement, situated on higher ground, largely escaped the flooding but was cut off from neighboring communities for several weeks. During this isolation, something changed. A physician from Sneedville, who had occasionally treated Melungeon patients, noted in his private correspondence that when he finally reached Vardy in late March, he found the residents uncommonly withdrawn, reluctant to speak of the winter's hardships. He also observed that several children appeared to be suffering from an unusual malady, causing tremors and sensitivity to light. Symptoms he could not readily diagnose. Then came the letter. 3 weeks before the disappearance, Elijah Mason received correspondence from a man named William Brownlow, a representative of the newly formed Cumberland Coal and Timber Company. The contents of this letter were never publicly disclosed, but a neighbor from a nearby settlement later recalled Elijah appearing troubled like I'd never seen after its arrival. Whatever was communicated clearly disturbed the community leader. I managed to track down what may be a copy of this letter in the corporate archives of what is now Consolidated Natural Resources, the successor to several Appalachian timber and coal operations. The document, dated March 30th, 1895, makes no explicit threats, but informs Mason that geological surveys had detected significant coal deposits beneath Vardy, and that the company was prepared to take all necessary legal measures to secure rightful access to these critical resources. The letter concluded with an offer to purchase the entire settlement for a sum that, while substantial on paper, represented a fraction of the land's true value. What Brownlow didn't mention But what company records clearly show was that Cumberland had already secured mining rights to all surrounding properties and had begun constructing a rail spur that would terminate less than 2 miles from Vardy. The timing suggests a coordinated strategy to isolate and then acquire the Melungeon settlement by whatever means necessary. In the weeks following this letter, visitors to Vardy noted increasing anxiety among the residents. The local postmaster recorded that mail volume from the settlement increased dramatically, with letters being sent to Melungeon communities in Virginia, North Carolina, and as far away as Maryland. The contents of these letters remain unknown, but their timing suggests a community reaching out to their extended networks, perhaps seeking advice or warning others. The night before their disappearance, several unusual events were noted by outsiders who occasionally traded with the Melungeons. Jacob Werner, a German immigrant who operated a general store 7 miles from Vardy, reported an unusual number of Melungeon men purchasing ammunition, preserved foods, and medical supplies. They seemed urgent, he later told a local newspaper, but wouldn't say why they needed such quantities. A trapper who maintained lines near the settlement reported hearing wailing sounds like singing but mournful, echoing through the valley that night. Most telling was an account I discovered in the memoir of Mary Ransom, a midwife who lived in neighboring Scott County. Upon arriving after a challenging journey, she found no one in need of my services, but rather the entire community gathered in their chapel, engaged in what appeared to be preparation for departure. She described children wearing multiple layers of clothing despite the warm spring weather, adults packing small bundles with what looked like family heirlooms and documents, and the community's elders marking each person's forehead with a paste made from local clay while speaking words in a language I did not recognize. When she asked Elijah Mason what was happening, he reportedly told her, "The earth beneath us is no longer safe." She wrote of being summoned to Vardy on April 16th, the day before Collins would find it abandoned, to attend a difficult birth. "We go to the deep places where our ancestors once dwelled." Confused and somewhat frightened by the atmosphere, Ransom departed before nightfall. Her account ends with the observation that as she left, she noticed men posting peculiar markings made of twisted branches and stones along the paths leading into the settlement. By sunrise the next morning, Vardy was empty. Breakfast dishes sat on tables, still containing food. Doors were locked from inside, windows shuttered. Personal belongings remained in place: clothing, family Bibles, photographs. The only living things remaining were chickens wandering the dusty paths between cabins. Even the dogs had vanished with their masters. Collins, arriving to conduct his census, found himself documenting an absence rather than a population. His official report maintained professional detachment, but his personal journal reveals genuine distress. "I cannot account for what I have witnessed today. It is as if the very people I was sent to count wished not to be counted, not merely in the census, but in the very record of existence." What manner of fear or coercion could prompt such a complete and sudden exodus? And how could so many depart without detection? The days following the disappearance brought unusual weather, heavy rains that swelled the creeks and washed away any tracks that might have indicated the direction of travel. When Collins arrived to conduct his census, the ground was already becoming reclaimed by nature, spring weeds pushing up through garden plots and morning glory vines beginning to climb porch railings. I uncovered weather station data confirming an unseasonable deluge dropped nearly 6 inches of rain in the 24 hours following the disappearance, almost a month's worth of precipitation in a single day. Local newspapers described it as the most severe April storm in living memory, causing landslides that blocked mountain roads and hampered any potential search efforts. The official explanation, such as it was, centered on voluntary abandonment. Authorities suggested the Melungeons, facing increasing pressure from surrounding communities and limited economic opportunities, simply decided to relocate en masse to another region. Some speculated they had joined other Melungeon communities in North Carolina or Virginia. Others suggested they had returned to whatever mysterious homeland had spawned them in the first place. A statement issued by the county sheriff's office 1 week after Collins's report declared, "The transient population previously residing in the Vardy Hollow appears to have relocated of their own accord." No evidence of foul play has been discovered, and given the historical tendencies of these people toward nomadic behavior, no further investigation is warranted. This statement conveniently ignored the Melungeons' multi-generational residence in the area and their established agricultural practices. But these explanations ignored crucial evidence. No one had seen large groups traveling on any of the limited roads leading from the settlement. No other Melungeon communities reported an influx of Vardy residents, and most importantly, they left behind possessions no poor mountain family would willingly abandon: tools, cookware, handmade quilts, family heirlooms. The Melungeons lived on the margins of society, but they valued their few possessions deeply. In my research, I cross-referenced census records from other known Melungeon communities before and after the Vardy disappearance. Not a single family from Vardy appears in subsequent population counts anywhere in the region. It was as if 160 individuals had simply ceased to exist in any official capacity. Birth records, death certificates, marriage licenses, the ordinary paper trail of human existence show no trace of the Vardy Melungeons after April 1895. More troubling were the rumors that began circulating in neighboring communities, whispers of unusual activities in the weeks before the disappearance. A mail carrier reported seeing unfamiliar men on horseback watching the settlement from ridgelines. A hunter claimed to have encountered government men asking questions about the Melungeons' land claims. The local doctor who occasionally treated Melungeon patients recalled Naomi Mason appearing at his office with questions about remedies for arsenic poisoning just days before vanishing herself. In the doctor's ledger, which I viewed at the Tennessee Medical Heritage Collection, he noted that Naomi appeared uncharacteristically agitated and described symptoms consistent with low-level poisoning affecting multiple children in the settlement: nausea, weakness, confusion, and in some cases, violent seizures. When he offered to visit Vardy to examine the children directly, she reportedly refused, saying, "They are watching the roads now. It would not be safe for you." The doctor's final note on the matter, dated April 15th, just 2 days before the discovery of the abandonment, reads, "Miss Mason returned today, more desperate than before. She inquired about caves in the region and whether certain medicinal fungi might counteract metallic poisoning. Her questions suggest they believe their water source has been deliberately contaminated." I offered again to alert authorities, but she laughed in a manner that chilled me and said, "They are the authorities." These accounts never made it into official records. Those who spoke too loudly about the disappearance found themselves ostracized or threatened. Within months, discussion of the vanished Melungeons became taboo in local establishments. When Cumberland Coal and Timber erected a sawmill on the former settlement lands in November 1895, locals accepted the jobs offered without question. The memory of those who had lived there began to fade like morning mist over the mountains. What struck me most during my investigation was the thoroughness with which the Vardy Melungeons were erased from official record. County archives show land transfers from Melungeon ownership directly to Cumberland Coal and Timber, but no bills of sale, no signatures, no legal documentation of how this transfer was accomplished. Tax records for the properties simply change hands as if the previous owners had never existed. Even more disturbing was my discovery of a series of obituaries published in the Bristol newspaper in May and June of 1895. Obituaries for several prominent Vardy residents, including Elijah Mason. These death notices provided no details of cause or location, merely stating that these individuals had passed away and were interred in family plots. No such burials took place in any registered cemetery in the region. It appears someone was creating a paper trail to explain the absence of people who had not, in fact, been confirmed dead. 15 years passed. The forest around the former settlement had been stripped bare, leaving eroded hillsides and silted streams where vibrant woodland once stood. The cabins had been dismantled or burned, their stone chimneys standing like grave markers across the scarred landscape. Cumberland Coal and Timber had extracted their profit and moved on, leaving behind unemployed workers and environmental devastation. Company records from this period show that despite extensive mining operations throughout the surrounding area, excavation beneath the former Vardy settlement was abruptly halted in 1897 after a series of unexplained accidents. Internal memoranda reference unusual subsidence, inexplicable flooding, and most intriguingly, disturbances from below that have rendered the men unwilling to continue work in this sector. The planned mine shaft was sealed and the area designated unsuitable for extraction, despite preliminary surveys indicating rich coal deposits. What could have caused a profit-driven company to abandon a promising mining operation? One clue comes from the journal of the site foreman, which describes workers reporting voices echoing through the shaft as if from great distance, and tools disappearing when left unattended, only to be found arranged in peculiar patterns deeper in the excavation. Most concerning was his final entry regarding the site. Today we broke through into what appears to be a natural cavern of considerable size. The men refused to enter, claiming they saw movement in the darkness. Johnson insists he heard children laughing. I have ordered the shaft sealed until proper illumination can be arranged. The shaft was indeed sealed, not with temporary barriers, but with a concrete plug and reinforced timber bracing. No further attempt was made to access the coal beneath Vardy. Maps from this period show the area marked simply as subsidence zone, no entry. The company's annual report to shareholders made no mention of the abandoned operation, focusing instead on more successful excavations elsewhere. In the spring of 1910, a young woman arrived in Bristol, Tennessee. She gave her name as Rebecca Collins and claimed to be researching Appalachian folk traditions for a university in Boston. Her questions, however, focused specifically on the Vardy settlement and the vanished Melungeons. Most locals refused to speak with her or offered only the standard explanation of voluntary relocation. But Rebecca was persistent, following leads to aging witnesses and combing through county records that had somehow survived mysterious courthouse fires. Through careful research, I believe I've identified this woman as Rebecca Mason Collins, Naomi Mason's daughter, who would have been an infant at the time of the disappearance. Birth records from the Vardy settlement confirm that Naomi gave birth to a daughter in October 1894, just months before the community vanished. The name Rebecca appears in Sarah Mason's family Bible, preserved in a private collection, with the notation, firstborn of Naomi, last of our line in the sunlit world. What drew attention was not just her questions, but her appearance. Though dressed in modern city clothes, Rebecca had the distinctive features often associated with Melungeon ancestry: copper skin, wavy dark hair, and striking gray eyes. Some older residents whispered that she bore a remarkable resemblance to Naomi Mason, though Naomi would have been at least 20 years older than this young woman. Rebecca took a room at a boarding house in Sneedville and began making daily trips into the surrounding mountains. She carried a leather satchel filled with notebooks, maps, and a Kodak camera, unusual equipment for a woman traveling alone in these remote areas. The landlady reported that Rebecca often returned after dark, her clothes muddied, sometimes with scratches on her hands and face, as if she'd been forcing her way through brambles and underbrush. I located the guest register from this boarding house, still preserved by the Historical Society in Sneedville. Rebecca Collins stayed for exactly 17 days in April 1910, almost precisely 15 years after the disappearance. The landlady's personal notes, kept in a separate ledger, describe her guest as well-spoken but secretive, and mention that she received no mail or visitors during her stay. Most intriguing is the observation that Rebecca seems to know her way around these mountains despite claiming to be from Boston, and speaks with a slight mountain inflection when tired or distressed. During her stay, Rebecca visited the county recorder's office, the local newspaper archives, and according to several accounts, made at least 5 trips to the former Vardy settlement, now an overgrown clearing surrounded by second-growth forest. A forest ranger reported encountering her near one of the abandoned mine entrances, making detailed sketches of the terrain and collecting soil samples in small glass vials. After 2 weeks of investigation, Rebecca's demeanor changed dramatically. The landlady found her burning papers in the bedroom fireplace late one night. When questioned, Rebecca simply said, "Some truths are too dangerous to preserve." The next morning, she paid her bill and announced she was traveling to Knoxville. She was never seen in the region again. What Rebecca discovered during her investigation remains largely unknown. Her formal research was never published, and no university in Boston acknowledged sponsoring her work. However, 3 months after her departure, a series of anonymous letters arrived at newspapers throughout Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky. These letters detailed accusations of an orchestrated campaign to drive the Melungeons from their land, a conspiracy allegedly involving county officials, timber company executives, and even federal agents. I've obtained copies of these letters from newspaper archives and private collections. They describe in methodical detail how Cumberland Coal and Timber, in collaboration with local officials, first attempted to purchase the Vardy land, then resorted to intimidation when legal means failed. The letters allege that the company poisoned the settlement's water sources with industrial waste from nearby operations, causing the illness that the doctor had documented in the children. Most explosive was the claim that when these tactics failed to drive the Melungeons away, representatives of the federal government's Geological Survey approached Elijah Mason with an ultimatum: leave voluntarily or face forcible removal under emerging segregation laws that would reclassify the Melungeons as colored, stripping them of land rights and subjecting them to increasingly violent Jim Crow restrictions. The letters claimed the Melungeons hadn't left voluntarily but had fled after systematic intimidation, poisoned wells, and threats of violence. Most newspapers refused to publish these allegations, but the Knoxville Sentinel ran a heavily edited version that prompted a swift denial from Cumberland Coal and Timber and veiled threats of legal action. The newspaper retracted the story in its next edition, blaming an overzealous junior editor for the unfounded accusations. I traced the paper stock and typeface used in these letters to a small print shop in Baltimore with known connections to early civil rights organizations. This suggests Rebecca may have sought allies in her quest to expose what happened at Vardy, though no record exists of her contacting these groups directly. One artifact from Rebecca's investigation did survive, a photograph now housed in the archives of Appalachia at East Tennessee State University. The image shows a cave entrance hidden behind a waterfall, its mouth partially obscured by vegetation. Written on the back in faded ink: "The refuge. They survived, but at what cost?" The children's eyes haunt me still. Using geographical information from historical maps and modern terrain data, I believe I've identified this location as part of an extensive cave system that runs beneath the former Vardy settlement and surrounding mountains. Geological surveys from the early 1900s make brief mention of this system, but note that exploration was discontinued due to dangerous conditions and instability. Modern cavers report that sections of this system remain unexplored, with narrow passages that seem to have been deliberately blocked by rockfalls or human intervention. Local legends speak of strange sounds coming from remote caves in the area during the decades following the disappearance, sounds described variously as singing, weeping, or chanting in an unknown language. Hunters reported glimpsing people with the Melungeon look watching them from ridgelines before melting into the forest. Several claimed to have found complex arrangements of stones and branches that didn't appear natural, but seemed deliberately placed as markers or warnings. One particularly detailed account comes from a timber cruiser named Samuel Yancey, who in 1923 became lost in a sudden fog while marking trees near the former settlement. In his written statement to the Forestry Service, he described stumbling upon a small garden of unfamiliar plants, tended with care, hidden within a box canyon that appeared on no map. As he examined this discovery, he claimed to have been surrounded by small figures, moving with unusual quickness, who escorted him, blindfolded, for what seemed like hours before releasing him near a road miles from where he'd started. When he returned with colleagues the next day, they found no trace of the garden or the canyon he described. The official report dismissed his experience as disorientation caused by forest vapors and possible consumption of local moonshine. Yancey, however, maintained his account until his death, adding the detail in later tellings that his unseen guides had spoken among themselves in a language that sounded like water running over stones. In 1933, during the construction of a civilian conservation corps road through the area, workers uncovered a network of caves extending deep into the mountainside near the former settlement. Inside, they discovered evidence of prolonged human habitation: crude furniture, cooking implements, children's toys carved from wood. More disturbing were the drawings covering the walls, intricate maps of the surrounding terrain marked with symbols that matched those Collins had noted carved into trees nearly 40 years earlier. The official report filed by the CCC project manager describes these findings in clinical detail, but concludes that the cave was likely a temporary shelter used by vagrants or moonshiners, though the extent of the modifications suggests extended occupation. No connection to the vanished Melungeons was officially acknowledged, though several workers reportedly recognized items similar to those known to have been used in the Vardy settlement. The CCC foreman, a man named Davis, ordered the cave sealed with dynamite after several workers refused to continue construction, claiming to have heard voices whispering from deeper passages. Davis later suffered a nervous breakdown, reportedly waking his family one night, screaming about eyes watching from the darkness and children who aren't children anymore. He was committed to the state hospital in Knoxville, where he died 3 months later without ever providing a coherent explanation for his terror. I located Davis's medical records through a Freedom of Information request. His attending physician noted that the patient repeatedly drew the same symbol on any available surface, a circular design, with 6 radiating lines that matches exactly the markings Collins had described on the trees surrounding Vardy in 1895. The doctor's assessment reads, "Patient exhibits signs of severe traumatic response to an undisclosed event." His delusions center on encounters with what he describes as people who live in the dark, whom he believes have been observing our world while remaining hidden from it. As decades passed, the story of the vanished Melungeons transformed from recent history to local legend. Parents warned children to stay away from certain hollows where the mountain people might take you. Developers avoided particular tracts of land despite their valuable timber and mineral rights. Even as official records minimized or rationalized the disappearance, cultural memory preserved a sense that something profoundly wrong had occurred in those mountains, something that remained unresolved. The most persistent stories involved children who wandered too far into the wilderness, returning with accounts of being watched, followed, or even briefly accompanied by people who looked strange but knew every plant and animal by name. These encounters were typically dismissed as imagination, but their consistency across decades and communities suggests a shared experience that defies simple explanation. In 1972, anthropologist Dr. Eleanor Maynard began researching Melungeon communities throughout Appalachia for her doctoral dissertation. Her work took her to county archives, oral history collections, and remote communities where people still identified with their Melungeon heritage. When she began asking about the Vardy settlement, she encountered resistance, unlike anything she'd experienced in her previous research. "Doctor, Maynard's field notes, which I accessed through her university archives, express increasing frustration with the walls of silence she encountered. It's as if the very mention of Vardy triggers a collective shuttering of doors and windows. People who have spoken freely about other sensitive topics, family feuds, illicit activities, even racial violence, become immediately guarded when this particular settlement is mentioned. People either refused to discuss it entirely or recited the official explanation as if reading from a script, she wrote in her field notes. When pressed, many would simply say, "Some things are better left alone." The fear was palpable, even generations later. Dr. Maynard persisted, tracking down descendants of families who had lived near Vardy. Most maintained the collective silence, but one elderly woman, speaking on condition of anonymity, offered a different perspective. Her grandmother had been midwife to several Melungeon families and had visited the settlement regularly before its abandonment. Grand said they were experimenting on those people, the woman told Maynard. Men from the government came with promises of medicine, special treatments for their children. The Melungeons had always been different, some born with extra fingers or blue gums or strange growths. The men said they could help, make the children normal. But Grand said whatever they were doing wasn't helping. It was changing them in worse ways. The interview continues with the woman describing how her grandmother had observed children in the settlement developing unusual physical characteristics. Sensitivity to sunlight so severe they could only come outside at dusk, digestive problems that required special diets, and, most disturbing, eyes that seemed to reflect light, like a cat's, when caught in certain angles. The grandmother had attributed these changes to whatever treatments the government men were administering, supposedly to address congenital conditions common among the isolated community. This account aligned with several entries in Collins's journal that had been largely ignored. His mentions of unusual physical characteristics among the younger children of the settlement, and his disturbing observation that many appear to suffer from the same malady, their movements jerky, eyes clouded, speech impaired. What modern researchers recognize as potential symptoms of mercury or arsenic poisoning, Collins and his contemporaries viewed through a lens of superstition and racial pseudoscience. Dr. Maynard's research took an unexpected turn when she discovered land transfer records indicating that the Vardy settlement lands hadn't been sold to Cumberland Coal and Timber. They had been transferred to the Department of War 6 weeks before the disappearance. This transfer was reversed 3 months later, with the land then passing to the Timber Company. No explanation for this temporary federal ownership appears in any accessible records. This discovery led Maynard to file Freedom of Information Act requests with multiple federal agencies, seeking any documents related to Vardy or government interactions with Melungeon communities. The responses were uniformly negative. No records existed, or if they did, they could not be released due to national security concerns. One response from the Department of Interior was particularly noteworthy for its specificity. Any records relating to geological or anthropological studies in eastern Tennessee during the period in question remain classified under Executive Order 11-5B2. This executive order, signed by President Nixon in 1972, established the classification system for national security information. The reference to anthropological studies seemed oddly specific and entirely out of place for what should have been, at most, a minor land transfer from a century earlier. As Maynard prepared to publish her findings, she received an unmarked envelope containing a single photograph, a family portrait showing several adults and children with distinctive Melungeon features. The subject's eyes had been scratched out of the image, and across the back was written, "They still watch from the hollow mountains. Do not wake them." She dismissed this as an attempt at intimidation, but delayed her publication nonetheless. 3 weeks later, Maynard's research office at the university was broken into. Her notes on the Vardy settlement, and only those notes, were stolen. The university police characterized it as a random act of vandalism, despite the selective nature of the theft. Maynard's dissertation, when finally published, contained only a brief mention of the Vardy community, citing insufficient documentation for academic conclusions. I interviewed Dr. Maynard in 2017, by then retired and living in Arizona. She initially refused to discuss Vardy, but when presented with my own research, reluctantly shared her experience. I was visited by two men claiming to be from the Department of Interior, she told me. They explained very politely that my research was disrupting delicate ecological restoration work in the area. When I pointed out that studying a historical community shouldn't affect current conservation efforts, one of them smiled and said, "Dr. Maynard, some ecosystems include more than plants and animals." They suggested my career opportunities would be severely limited if I continued this particular line of inquiry. In the late 1990s, as interest in Appalachian heritage and genealogy surged, several descendants of Melungeon families began conducting their own investigations into the Vardy disappearance. They formed an informal research collective, sharing documents, photographs, and family stories online. Their work attracted both support from other Melungeon descendants and harassment from anonymous sources. Several reported break-ins, threatening phone calls, and mysterious surveillance. The group's website, Vanished Vardy, contained an impressive archive of primary sources, land records, personal correspondence, oral histories, and photographic evidence. Much of this material corroborated the pattern I had been tracing, a systematic effort to remove the Melungeons from valuable land, followed by an equally systematic erasure of their existence from official records. Most compelling was their collection of family stories passed down through generations of Melungeon descendants in other communities. These narratives consistently mentioned the people who went beneath, or those who returned to the dark places. Many included variations of a warning. If the lights on the ridge begin to move in circles, go inside and do not watch, for they are counting who remains. The most disturbing development came in 2001, when group member Thomas Mullins ventured into the area where the cave system had been sealed decades earlier. Despite warnings from locals, Mullins spent 3 days exploring the surrounding terrain. On the third day, he reported finding a narrow entrance that appeared to connect to the larger cave network, an opening too small for the original CCC workers to have noticed. Mullins's final communication was a voicemail left for fellow researcher Jessica Collins, no relation to the census taker. "I found something. Markings like the ones in the old photographs. But they're fresh, Jess. Someone's still maintaining them. And I swear I heard singing coming from deeper in the cave. I'm going in for a closer look. If I'm not back by tomorrow, call—" The message ended abruptly. Mullins never returned. Search and rescue teams found his vehicle parked near an abandoned logging road, but no trace of Mullins himself. The official report concluded he had likely fallen into one of the many sinkholes that dot the landscape, his body washed away by underground streams. His research notes, camera, and recording equipment were never recovered. What's particularly troubling about this incident is the response it triggered. Within days of Mullins's disappearance, the area was cordoned off by officials claiming to be from the Environmental Protection Agency, citing concerns about abandoned mine drainage and potential contamination. Access to a 5-square-mile area surrounding the former Vardy settlement was restricted for nearly 6 months. When researchers finally regained access, they discovered that the cave entrance Mullins had reported finding had been sealed with fresh concrete. The research collective disbanded shortly thereafter. Their website disappeared, and members stopped responding to inquiries. Jessica Collins moved abruptly to Oregon, changing her name and refusing all contact with former associates. The last post on their defunct forum, authored by an anonymous user, read simply, "They never vanished. They're waiting, and now they know we're looking." I managed to locate Jessica Collins, now living under another name, in 2019. She initially refused to speak with me, but eventually agreed to a brief conversation after I shared detailed aspects of my research that convinced her of my legitimate interest. Thomas found them, she told me, her voice barely above a whisper despite us being alone in her home. Not just evidence of them, still living down there, still watching us. He sent me something before that last call. A video clip so dark you can barely see anything, but you can hear them moving, speaking in that language none of us recognized. And right at the end, just for a second, there's a face in the frame. She refused to share this video, claiming she had destroyed it after watching it once. They've adapted to living in the dark, she said. Generation after generation, changing to survive in ways humans shouldn't be able to change. The government knows, has always known. That's why they keep sealing the caves, restricting access. Not to protect us from some environmental hazard, but to protect us from knowing what's been living beneath our feet for over a century. Today, the land where Vardy once stood remains unusually undeveloped. Attempts to establish tourism, mining operations, or even hiking trails in the area have failed. Projects abandoned after accidents, financial problems, or unexplained equipment failures. Locals still avoid certain hollows after dark, though few could articulate exactly why. The cultural memory persists even as the historical record remains incomplete. In 2015, a conservation easement was placed on much of the land, ostensibly to protect watershed quality and wildlife habitat. The organization that manages this easement lists no physical address and conducts all business through a law firm in Knoxville. My requests to access the property for research purposes were denied without explanation. Satellite imagery shows the area remains heavily forested, with no visible structures or development, unusual in a region where economic pressures typically favor resource extraction over conservation. Most recently, in 2020, geological survey equipment placed in the area to monitor seismic activity recorded what one scientist described as movement patterns inconsistent with known wildlife or human activity, regular, deliberate disturbances that suggest organized behavior beneath the surface. This data was subsequently reclassified and removed from public access. What truly happened to the Melungeons of Vardy? Were they victims of a government experiment gone wrong, as some accounts suggest? Did they flee into the cave systems to escape persecution, establishing a hidden community that somehow survived for decades? Or does the truth lie somewhere in the territory of more mundane but no less horrific human cruelty, forced relocation, resource theft, and the systematic erasure of an inconvenient people? Perhaps most disturbing is how easily their disappearance was accepted, how readily society embraced explanations that absolved them of responsibility. The vanishing of an entire community became merely an anecdote, their humanity reduced to local legend. Their story stands as testament to how effectively marginalized people can be removed not just from their land, but from history itself. As I conclude this investigation, I'm left with one final discovery. A Department of Interior memorandum dated 1943, declassified in 2017, but overlooked in broader historical research. It references ongoing containment procedures at the Tennessee site and recommends maintaining current protocols until biological degradation is complete, estimated 2 to 3 generations. The document is heavily redacted, but one margin note remains legible. Subjects still demonstrate unusual resilience. Genetic samples of high value despite contamination concerns. This clinical language, so at odds with the human tragedy it appears to reference, perhaps reveals the true horror of what happened at Vardy. Not that a community vanished, but that their vanishing was observed, documented, and studied by the very institutions entrusted with protecting all citizens. That the descendants of those who fled into darkness might still exist in some altered form, adapted to a subterranean existence across generations, is a possibility too disturbing for most to contemplate. If you find yourself driving through eastern Tennessee, through those valleys where mist clings to mountainsides and sunlight struggles to reach the forest floor, you might notice certain hollers where the birds fall silent, where even deer and bears won't venture. Locals will tell you to keep moving, not to stop, not to listen too carefully to the sounds that might rise from the ground beneath your feet. They'll tell you some places are best left undisturbed, not because they believe in ghosts, but because they understand that the most haunting presences are those of human wrongs never acknowledged, human stories never properly laid to rest. The Melungeons of Vardy didn't vanish. They were vanished, erased by forces that found their existence inconvenient. And in that erasure lies the true horror, not what might lurk in mountain caves, but what lurks in our collective willingness to look away, to accept comfortable lies, to forget those deemed forgettable. That is the legacy that echoes still through those hollow mountains, a silence that speaks volumes to those willing to listen.